What's going on, everyone? Today we've got the Redcat Gen 8 here, and we're going to look at removing, disassembling, reassembling, and reinstalling the center transmission. Of course, the first step is to remove the body. Next, we need to remove the battery tray. We need to remove the 5 screws on top of the battery tray, as well as the 1 screw in the passenger side fender well. In order to get the battery tray out of the way, disconnect the plug going from the ESC to the receiver box. And then you can just move it out of position. Also at this time, disconnect the red and black bullet connectors so that the motor is no longer attached to the ESC. To completely remove the transmission from the vehicle, there are 2 more screws along the driver's side frame rail. At this time, slide the entire assembly forward to disconnect the 2 halves of the drive shaft, and then pull the whole transmission out. At this time, we've got the entire front portion of the motor and transmission assembly. There's a rubber plug on the front of this. You can remove that easily just by pulling on it. You can remove that plug by pulling on it, and underneath there you will see the nut that you have to tighten or loosen the slipper clutch. To gain access to your gear mesh adjustment, there's a single screw down here at the bottom of this cover that you can remove with your 1.5mm driver. Once that screw is removed, you can just lift up on that cover. Here you can see the 2 screws that hold the motor to the motor plate. To remove the motor completely, you would remove those 2 screws. I'm not going to remove the motor from the motor plate at this time. To remove the motor plate from the rest of the transmission, there's 3 screws on the back side of this. Mine did not ship with this lower screw, and I need to get that replaced. Remove all 3 screws, and then you can separate the motor plate from the transmission. Underneath here, we've got the spur gear and slipper assembly. Using a 7mm nut driver, you can remove the nut holding the slipper assembly together. You will need a firm grip on the rear drive shaft assembly to keep that from spinning while doing so. So underneath that nut, we have a total of 5 of these spring style washers. That's what provides the tension against the slipper pads and slipper plates to provide the actual slipping function of this assembly. With those removed, you can now pull off the aluminum slipper plate, followed by the spur gear. And lastly, there will be an additional slipper plate. The spur gear has slipper material on both sides. If you wanted to lock this out completely, you would remove those pieces of material, and then these plates would fit securely into that spur gear. If you ever need to replace this spur gear, make sure that you either get pads with the spur gear, can remove or reuse the stock pads, or buy new ones separately. To gain access to this portion of the transmission, we need to remove 4 more screws, 3 on this side and 1 on the back side. The upper gear of this transmission rides on the spur gear top shaft. You can remove it by just pulling it out of position, and if you need to remove the plastic gear here, simply push it towards the threaded end of this top shaft. Now you're left with the top shaft as well as the drive pin for that top gear. The top pin will simply slide out of that top shaft. To remove the lower gear from this portion of the transmission case, you'll need to remove this rear drive shaft yoke. Your 1.5mm driver will remove the set pin that holds it to the output shaft. While disassembling this vehicle the first time, I did find that far too much Loctite was used from the factory. If you have any problem removing the set pin from the drive shaft, heat it up with the tip of your soldering iron, or if you have to, use a lighter directly on those threads to try and get that Loctite broken free. Make sure not to overheat the transmission case or the drive shaft parts, as you can melt them. But if you feel that it is very tight, heat it before you break your tool. Once the drive shaft is removed, you can simply push out that lower output shaft and gear assembly. The gear will slide outward towards that output. And again, underneath there, we'll find another drive pin that simply pushes out. If you need to remove the bearings from this portion of the case, you can use some sort of pick or one of the output shafts. The 4 bearings used in this portion of the transmission case are 3 5x10x4s and 1 4x8x3. To remove the transfer case, we just remove 4 screws, 2 on each side. With the 4 screws removed, you can just pull straight up to remove it and disconnect the drive shafts. At this point, we have 3 drive shaft outputs connected to this case. To separate the 2 halves of the transfer case, you do first need to remove one of these 2 outputs. Then we need to remove the 4 screws holding the 2 halves together. Now we can separate the 2 halves of the transfer case. To remove the drive gear, we also need to remove this portion of the drive shaft. And now we can pull out that input shaft and drive gear. That drive gear again is driven by a small pin. To remove the final drive gear, we can pull straight up onto that gear. And to remove this shaft completely, we also will need to remove this side of the drive shaft. And then we can pull straight out on that final output shaft. And lastly, if you need to remove bearings from the case, again, use a pick or the output shafts to push them out of the way. The transfer case uses 5x10x4 bearings on the input gear and 6x12x4 bearings on the lower output gear. To reassemble, first we're going to put our bearings back into the case. For reinstallation of the lower output shaft, first we'll replace the longer drive pin through the center hole of that shaft. And then we need to reinstall the lower plastic drive gear. Now for this shaft is not symmetrical from one side to the other. And we need to slide it over the shaft from the side that is longer up to this large diameter. You can see that from here to here is longer than from here to here. So again, slide it from this side over onto that pin. And then with the pin side going towards the rear of the vehicle, we're going to reinstall it into the side of the case with only one hole on the back side. It should look like that when installed. Next, we'll grab the input shaft. We'll slide the drive pin through the hole that is more towards the inside of the shaft. You can see that this one here is closer to the end than the one that we're actually using. Then again, slide the gear on from the long side over that drive pin. We can then reinstall this shaft into the transfer case. Then take the thinner side of the transfer case and slide it over. We can then replace the 4 screws that hold the case together. Then we need to reinstall all of the drive shafts. I'm going to start with this short section of drive shaft, and that goes on the output where there is not one corresponding to it on the other side. You should again reinstall these set pins with a very small amount of Loctite so that they don't seize into these drive shaft yokes. The other 2 sections of drive shaft are exactly the same length, so it does not matter which side you put these on. To reassemble this portion, we're going to put the 4x8x3 bearing in the top portion of the rear half of the transmission case, a 5x10x4 in the lower section of the rear half of the case. Then we're going to take the output shaft and we're going to make sure to put the drive pin into the hole that is further in towards the center of the shaft, not the one that is closer towards the end. With the drive pin in place, we're then going to take the larger plastic gear and slide it onto the shaft from the output end. Then we're going to take this shaft and gear assembly and put it into the lower portion of the trans case. We can then install the portion of the drive shaft that we removed earlier just to make sure nothing comes apart. Reinstall the set pin into the drive shaft using a very small amount of Loctite. Next, we'll reassemble the top shaft, reinstall the drive pin in the hole in the top shaft towards the back side, and then slide the plastic gear on with the notch for the drive pin towards the back. Making sure that you have the bearing in the case, reinstall the top shaft into the back side of the transmission case. Grab the front half of the transmission case and reinstall the 2 bearings. Then slide the 2 halves of the transmission together. Reinstall the 4 screws that you took out earlier. Next, reinstall one of the slipper discs, followed by the spur gear, the other slipper disc, and then the 5 spring washers. When installing the spring washers, alternate between putting the cone side out versus the cone side in to give you the maximum amount of efficiency for these style of washers. And lastly, reinstall that lock nut. Tighten it down with your 7mm nut driver. Tighten it down with your 7mm nut driver until tight, and then I'm going to back off a little bit more than a 1/4 of a turn. Next, I'm going to reinstall the motor plate onto the transmission. I'm going to reinsert the rubber cover to protect that slipper assembly. And lastly, we're going to take the spur gear cover, slide it over top of the motor plate first, and then replace the small screw. So now at this time, the transfer case and front mounted transmission portions are ready to go back into the vehicle. To make things easier, I'm going to reinstall the front portion of the transmission into the vehicle first. Make sure to point the motor wires towards the ESC when you're reinstalling this into the vehicle. Then reinstall the 2 screws through the driver's side frame rail. Before reinstalling the transfer case, hook up the drive shafts. It's best if you can line up the drive shaft yokes on this end with the end on the axle, but these drive shafts don't perfectly line up, so just get them as close as you can. Make sure and hook up the section that goes between the transfer case and the transmission. And lastly, reinstall the 4 screws that hold the transfer case into the vehicle. With all of that in order, we can now swing the battery tray back into position. Get it into position and replace the 5 screws on top of the battery tray. And lastly, don't forget the screw that goes into the passenger side fender well. Before completing this, make sure to hook back up the motor. The black wire corresponds to black and red to red. And lastly, don't forget to hook back up the wire from your ESC to the receiver box. And lastly, reinstall the body. And that wraps up how to disassemble and reassemble the transmission. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you aren't already, and we'll see you on the next one.